gotta watch out for. He's
working on that.
That's the reason he wears his hat, Matt. He puts stuff underneath his hat.
We're just afraid he's gonna get hurt.
We have a great new crimper that I want all of you guys to see and see the excitement because it is awesome. And it gives your customers a lot of extra benefits that they didn't get from anything before. And it's really a leader in the marketplace. And the reason that it's a leader, the biggest reason, is that it has 4 crimp dies. So there's 4 slots on there. Has anybody ever seen one that has 4 crimp dies on it?
Never heard of it.
Doesn't exist. Didn't exist until now. So if they didn't exist before, how did they crimp? Right? It's not like they didn't need to do that before. They'd have some way of crimping. Well, they couldn't use this one because this only goes up to 10 or 12 gauge. Okay, this is just a standard crimper. Can't use this one because it's got 3 slots. Okay, 3 crimp dies. Only goes up again to 10, 12, that yellow die there at the end. So can't use that one. What they would use is this. It's a standard crimper. How do I know that I pushed it the right amount for that size crimp? I have no idea. I could have pushed it too far. Okay, in fact, I did one before you got here, and I'll just pass this around. I crimped the red end, because that's the new 8 gauge side. So I crimped that end with this crimp die. And is there any room in there for wire?
No.
No, it crimps it totally flat because you just push and push and push and push. It doesn't say stop. Right? There is no level at which you say, okay, now I've done it far enough for 8 gauge, or I've done it far enough for 10, 12 gauge. You just push as hard as you can. Plus, on this, I have to create all of the force that's going to crimp close that connector. So I can't rely on some other, extra push, and it's a lot. In fact, it's even more on a crimp connector like this. This is a vinyl reducing butt connector, okay? And it's actually one that goes from 8 gauge, this is an 8 gauge wire, to a 10-12, okay? The yellow side is where the 10-12 wire goes, so it's thinner. And so that side, and I'll pass these around so you can take a look at them, that side has a thicker copper wall. So if you look at the holes on each side, one is thicker than the other.
It sure is.
Well, that thicker side is much harder to crimp because it's got a whole bunch of copper in there. So if you try to take these crimp tools and try to crimp that yellow side,
Oh boy, gotta have muscles.
okay, that's as far as I can get it holding on to it. And I'm not even close. Okay, I haven't even got it close to crimped far enough.
They can waste
Okay.
a lot of time if
So-
it's not an accurate.
And imagine if you have to do more than one.
Hello.
Okay? I'm going to have to push on the table and use all of my weight just to try to get it to crimp down. They've been able to do something to get these crimped before, but it hasn't been a good solution. Okay? So, what do we have now to offer in the Super Magna-Crimp? The coolest thing is that 8 gauge die. The other feature is, if you could hear it, it's ratcheting. Okay? So like this tool here, all of my force, I got to do it all, right? I got to have big Popeye arms. That one, I got to do it all. It's all my force. This one, I put just a little bit of force on the end, and it's magnified by the ratchet down here to the crimp side. So very little force, and I'm able to crimp any sort of connector. So now I don't have to work as hard. Everybody likes that. Okay? The other part is it's got this release switch on it. So why do I need a release switch? Well, maybe I stick this connector in here and I put it on the yellow side because it's got a yellow stripe. And I start to close it down and I'm like, oh, that's not supposed to go on the yellow side. It's supposed to go on the red one. Well, now I can't put it in the red one because I've already started it. Well, that's what the release switch is for. If I just push that button, it releases, I take it back out, I put it back in the right spot, and now I'm ready to crimp in the right spot. Other connectors have a release switch. This is another one. This is a ratcheting crimp tool. Okay? This is the release switch, this little thing on the inside. Now, I don't have very big hands. Maybe long fingers, but not big hands. But if I crimp this down even a little bit farther, I can't get my finger in there to push the switch.
Get another tool.
I gotta go get a screwdriver now so I can hit the tool, so I can release it. And if I don't hold this together when I do it, and I did this to myself earlier, you actually may pinch yourself because this ratcheting part comes out right where I was pushing forward, and I pinched my finger earlier trying to get it out. So putting it on the outside keeps my fingers out of the way. It's a safer tool because the release switch is on the outside. The last thing that it has is it's a one-sided die, so it only crimps on one side. And it has a little mating mechanism in the end to make sure that they stay aligned. So as I crimp down, you'll see that the piece on the bottom fits right into a slot on the top. Okay, well that keeps the two dies perfectly aligned, so the crimp always ends up in the right
In the right
spot.
spot.
Now why is it important that it's only one-sided? This one's a two-sided. See how it has two sides, two jaws? Okay, well the most common connector that people use is a butt connector.
Yeah.
Everybody uses a butt connector. If you have one that's got two-sided like that, and I did an example of this earlier, I'll pass this around. It actually crimps so far down on the connector that you will actually start to crimp the far side of the connector. Now, I don't have a wire usually in here on the other side. I put wire in one side and crimp it, put wire on the other side and crimp it. Well, I've already partially crimped that side. So now my wire doesn't go in all the way. So now I don't have a good crimp and I have a bad connection and then something goes wrong with the connection and I'm in trouble with my boss. And so I'll pass that around so you can take a look at it. So a one-sided crimp die, make sure that you're only putting the crimp where you want it. There isn't an extra one that's happening on the other side. And that's way more prevalent in a butt connector, but that's the most common connector they're going to run into. So how does it work, right? Does it really work like we want it to work? This is our vinyl reducing connector. It's an 8-gauge connector to 1012. Both sides crimp with an 8-gauge die, which is kind of confusing because there's a yellow stripe right there that would tell me that's 1012. But it's not. It's still 8-gauge. The whole connector is 8-gauge. It gets kind of confusing. But we're going to stick this in the 8-gauge side, and with the ratcheting action, you saw how far I could get on that one. Couldn't get it to go all the way. On this one, if I crimp on the 8-gauge, I can actually get a full crimp all the way down. Okay? Here, why don't you give it a shot? Do it on the side with the yellow stripe and put it put the bell just past the die. Pretty easy, huh? Now, if you look at your connector on the end, you should have a nice oval crimp on the end. You know what that hole's for? The wire. We just didn't crimp it with the wire this time. But that's leaving the space for the wire so that you know you have a good crimp for an 8-gauge wire. The multi-shrink connector has a distinct advantage over the vinyl reducing connector. Well, first of all, it's got the shrink tubing, which makes it a stronger connection in general. The other thing is that it actually has a step-down design. So I'm going to pass some of these around so you guys can see them. Instead of having that thick wall side and the thin wall side, and that thick wall being so hard to close on, this one actually has a big side and a little side. So if it goes with 1012 wire, it has a yellow stripe. You use the yellow die. So there's no confusion about yellow stripe, but it's a red die, and a yellow stripe is, no confusion. If it's a yellow stripe, use the yellow die. If it's a red stripe, use the red die. Okay, so it makes it really clear and easy, and there's no additional force required because it's a step-down design. The neat thing about this tool and what we were able to do is actually, with the customers in mind, we created an assortment. So this is the assortment that we created to go with that tool. And it's all butt connectors. What's the most common connector?
Butt connector.
Butt connectors. So it's all butt connectors, and it actually gives them a solution for both single wire butt connectors, where you just take one wire and you're mating it to one other wire, and multiple wire connectors. So you have two wires on one side and one wire on the other. So those are our crimp and shrink. That's single wire, and multi-shrink is for multiple wire. And this assortment contains all of the sizes that we carry, all the way up to 8-gauge. So we have a multiple wire connector all the way up to 8-gauge, and they can get that assortment with the crimp tool for $349 or without the tool for $299.